So I was in a bookstore the other day before lockdown, and a father came in with his teenage daughter. She must have been about 14, maybe 15, 16, I don't know, maybe 13. And he walked in, and he walked straight up to another man who was working there, and he says, I want to outline an educational program, a reading program for my teenage daughter, get her reading good works, getting her thinking, getting her reading more. Can you advise? I want 3 to 5 books, and we'll buy them, but I want your recommendation as someone who works here in a bookstore. And through all this, the young girl was quite mute. She wasn't saying anything. And obviously, immediately, I was kind of thinking, well, that's a good dad. That's someone who wants the best for his daughter. But he was speaking on behalf of his daughter and asking another man who immediately, he said, yep. He jumped to the task and he walked them both through the store, past the classics, past all the, the different, like the Russian fiction over here, the Argentine fiction over here, the, Homer, Jane Austen, and he went straight to the YA section with all the colourful spines and covers and stuff like that. And I overheard he was picking out some different books, not Twilight specifically, but of that ilk. Not that I'm ragging on Twilight too much, but he went and he started loading her up with these books. And I thought, if I had been asked, now obviously I'm British, so it would be immensely presumptuous of me to go over and say, actually, sir, I disagree with your choices. But I did catalogue in my mind, and I thought, it's unfortunate that a chance was squandered, because she's not been given some very good books. Anyway, so I started thinking, what books would I recommend? Say if I had a teenage daughter, what would I get her reading? And it might be a bit different from what I might get my teenage son reading, but there'd be some similarities. So this is what I would recommend. Now, it seems like an obvious choice, but I'd get her reading some Jane Austen, not the stuff that you study at school, not just relegated to Pride and Prejudice, but I'd get her picking up Persuasion and Emma and Sense and Sensibility and letting her see how the Shakespearean tradition has been carried on. Obviously, talking about the Shakespearean tradition, of course, we'd have to go back and look at some Shakespeare. So I'd be giving her the plays where Shakespeare is thinking through humanity, where he's imbued his characters with life. The great thing about Shakespeare is he didn't just write fantastic male characters, he wrote fantastic female characters. Everybody says Lady Macbeth, okay, sure, we'll have some Macbeth. But what about Anthony and Cleopatra? So I'd start loading her up on a few of the greatest Shakespearean plays. And Shakespeare's carrying on a tradition that goes all the way back from Chaucer. Obviously, Chaucer writing The Wife of Bath, her prologue, her tale. He has a vitality in his characters which sets the stage for later writers, to do a lot of thinking, to develop psychologically complex characters and think through the different grand themes of humanity. So we'd have a little bit of Chaucer, a little bit of Shakespeare, a little bit of Jane Austen. And now I might think, with the craziness, how crazy the world is right now, I might think I'm going to give you some George Orwell, as in 1984 and Animal Farm. But hey, we're going to stick with sort of like female voices. Then we're going to do Margaret Atwood instead, The Handmaid's Tale, all that sort of thing, all right? You might even go into some short story collections. And again, if we're sticking with female voices, because obviously without being an exclusionist or a sexist or whatever, we do resonate with voices that are quite similar to ours. So, okay, we're going to pick up some Shirley Jackson, The Lottery. Okay, we're going to pick up some Daphne du Maurier, Rebecca. And if we go back to that sort of fiction, the Atwood, Orwell stuff, we're going to pick up some Jung Chang, Wild Swans. Now, with just a few books like Wild Swans, perhaps like Man's Search for Meaning, it's so slim, it's worth reading. And like Orwell's work, because despite the fact that I'm going to put Margaret Atwood in her hands, I'm also going to encourage her to read George Orwell. Now you're starting to think about the state of the world, and you're starting to get an understanding of history and how history repeats itself and how our minds work and how our minds work as a collective as well as individuals. Then I'm going to throw in 2 huge novels, and I would ask her to take her time to really live in the world and really get to know the characters. The first one of those is going to be Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. That'll teach you empathy as you sort of take on the struggles of the main characters, and you chart one character's rise and another character's fall, and then we'll look into Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And what's so good about Les Miserables? Well, if you're reading Les Miserables, you're going to start thinking about ideals, idealism, like what's an ideal man, what's an ideal woman, and how that has been changed and perverted as the ages have gone on. So you start thinking about this sort of thing. Now, modern stuff, if I was talking to a guy and I wanted to recommend another guy, I'd put perhaps some Faulkner in his hands. Everybody says Hemingway, okay, he's the macho guy. Not sure I agree with that, but everyone says Faulkner, As I Lay Dying, Absalom, Absalom. But if it's a girl, we're going to put someone, a female writer, who's carrying on the Faulknerian tradition. So who's that? Toni Morrison, Song of Solomon. Maybe we'll look at some Flannery O'Connor, A Good Man's Hard to Find, and some of her other short stories. If she likes the short stories, then we're going to go on to one of the greatest short story writers in modern history. It's Alice Munro, Nobel Prize winner. I put a collection of her short stories in her hand as well. Now, obviously, if you're reading Toni Morrison and you're reading Flannery O'Connor, then you're going to have to need a biblical understanding, and we can't take an understanding of the Bible for granted these days. So I'd pick out a few choice books. I'd probably pick out a work of criticism such as Harold Bloom's work that details that the first few books in the Bible, like Genesis, were actually written by a woman who would have had a high station in a court. And I put that in her hands not as a religious text or a scripture, though it's okay if you want to go down that route, but as a work of literature, as a historical document, and as a sort of aesthetic object, so a bit of the Bible as well. And then we'd look into some of the great essayists, Montaigne, okay? We'd be looking into Thoreau and Emerson and thinking about self-reliance, because if I had a daughter, I'd want to be able to teach her not only sort of the ideals she might ascribe to, not just like this is what traditional femininity looks like and this is what the modern version looks like, but also this idea that you can do anything that you set your mind to. So you want to read works that focus on education and self-reliance, and I think Emerson, Thoreau would be two good ones for that. And then we would throw some Aristotle in there. Aristotle is how to think. Aristotle is critical thinking condensed. We'd go to the Nicomachean Ethics and we'd start talking about what a virtue is, what a vice is, because today I think that most people are degenerate in their actions, their behaviours, their wants and desires, their flat state of mind. People's habits are either they've given no thought to them at all, or they're just bad habits, and it corrodes people's souls. I know that sounds a bit snobbish, but I think that's because we're not teaching Aristotle in school anymore. We're not teaching Homer. We're not reading the great classics like Ovid. I would correct that. And then just for fun, I mean, you've got the classical femininity in Jane Austen. Well, let's have a sort of agonist to that and throw in some Friedrich Nietzsche. If you want to understand what a traditionally masculine man might be like, then you should read Nietzsche. And I think those would be better books, better book recommendations. They'd be more challenging. They'd force one to read over their head more than the books I saw being piled in that girl's arms as she walked out silently from the bookstore with her smiling father, who, got to hand it to him, he was asking the right questions but kind of got the wrong answers. Anyway, what books would you recommend for a teenage girl? Let me know.